Hi everyone, welcome to our fourth demo video. Last week we gave you 6 different techniques for measuring and sighting things in front of you and transferring those lines to your paper to develop an understructure for a more finished drawing. Today we're talking about a 7th technique that merits its own week of instruction and its own homework, and that's negative space. So negative space is really a separation between a figure and a ground. In this case, the figure I've chosen is this pair of channel locks, and the ground is just my white paper. Now I'm explaining that I'm looking specifically at the shapes around my channel locks, not the channel locks themselves. So I'm going to make a quick distinction. The figure in this case will consider the positive space, whereas the ground in this example will consider negative space. In drawing and other art forms, we use negative space as a way to double check that our drawings and paintings are accurate. Essentially, it is a tool for us to sort of unknow the objects as themselves and look for reference outside of them. Now in this video, we'll still be using the measuring and sighting techniques that we learned last week, especially dropping horizontals and verticals, as well as angle finding. But negative space, as we move forward, will start to become a measuring tool all of its own. For an example, I've chosen these 2 objects, my tape and my channel locks, to see if I can find some interesting negative space shapes to draw for you guys. I lay out a very quick compositional sketch with some lines, and then I lay my vine circle down on its side. In this exercise, we're going to be coloring all the negative space with our charcoal and leaving all of the positive space, that is, the space of the figure, the white of the paper. That's pretty much it. There's not a lot to it. So this is me just demonstrating a process so you can see what the final drawing might look like. We'll be doing it in compressed charcoal with your charcoal bricks and your charcoal pencils, not vine charcoal. The vine charcoal will just be an underdrawing tool to get the shapes and forms feeling correct. But yeah, let's zoom forward to see what a finished drawing might look like. Okay, so I'm almost complete with this example, and I want to explain something real quick. In negative space drawing, we don't include this line work. There's no preference of what object is in front of what other object. Remember, it's not about the objects. You're drawing the stuff that's around, the shapes that are around the objects. So in this example, and in your work too, we're not going to include those internal lines. They're going to all be one sort of cutaway mass. So in this very rough example, here we have all of the negative space filled in with my vine charcoal. And I want to demonstrate something here. So it's easy to continue, even in negative space drawing, to think about the figure, that is the channel locks and the tape in this example. But really what we want to encourage you to do is to take those internal measurements, angle finding, and horizontals and verticals off of the abstracted shapes between those forms, the negative spaces themselves. You can see me here putting some dimensional arrows on the spaces that I was looking at. For instance, underneath the handle of the channel locks, underneath the vise at the top, that sort of squarish shape between the grooved blades of the channel locks. Even here, I took some measurements comparing the height of the top half of that tape versus the height of the bottom half that I could see through between the channel lock bars and the bottom of the tape. And I took a horizontal measurement also that compared the entire width of the tape roll to the width of the channel lock head all the way to the tape roll itself. So a couple notes on this drawing method with negative space drawing. You'll see I've propped my channel locks and the tape up on their side, and they're resting on a table, and I'm looking at them in a perfect profile. So you'll notice that I have actually combined the white of my channel locks and the white of my table into one. I'm considering them both for the figure, and I recommend you do the same. Otherwise, your positive space will feel like it's an island floating in in darkness all around all around. So the surface that they're sitting on, for this example, we want to consider figure, whereas the space behind them we'll call the ground. Now I'll start a longer example so I can really show you the power of negative space drawing even with more complex objects. I tape down my paper, and this time, because we're going to be working with quite a bit of charcoal, I'm going to use my tape to create a border around the edge. When I lift my drawing off, especially if I mean for this drawing to be sort of a final complete work, having a border made from this tape with a white edge is really nice, especially when the charcoal runs all the way to the edge. So I suggest you do the same. I lay my tape half on the paper and half on my drawing board, and I stick it down, knowing that when I'm done, it'll leave me a nice, beautiful white border. Here's the still life that I'm working with. My wife got me some flowers. I have my painter's palette and a pruning saw leaned up against some boards. I'll try to reference my still life a little more frequently in this demo so you can see which negative spaces I'm currently working on. I start with an extremely quick and rough gesture. I capture the general shape of my vase. Not perfectly symmetrical, and that's great. It's just a gesture. The general lines and angles of my pruning saw. The general shape of some large, important leaves within that bouquet. Notice I'm putting in the line where my boards and table meet. I'm going to call that the edge of my work surface, where my ground and my figure meet. The border of my painter's palette, not being too specific yet, and several lines to indicate the positioning of the flower stalks. At this point in my gesture drawing, I'm ready to wipe out and think more specifically in an underdrawing with lots of extra structure to make sure I've got the shapes just right and specific enough so I can move forward. I begin with the vase because it's the most particular item here. Again, using my vine charcoal, I make sure I've got the right curvature at the bottom where it touches the surface, although eventually, in my negative space drawing, that line will be obliterated. I cast some verticals off the outmost edges of my vase, and you'll notice it's not perfectly symmetrical the first time I put it in. It takes some editing for me to get it to feel really symmetrical, and I have to put in a few guidelines to make sure I really get it. Those extra lines are extremely important in making sure that I get a shape that is uniform, symmetrical, and that makes sense given the perspective of the still life. I haven't got it completely right yet, but you'll see I come back to it later. I start working on the saw and finding the curvature as well as the pattern of the teeth. I start moving towards the flowers and the stems and stalks of each one, the leaves that come off. And much like our still life drawing from the previous week, the homework that you're probably just finishing up, we're really just using these structural lines to make sure that we've got everything in the right place. So far, no different than any other underdrawing we've undertaken so far. Remember, it's always a process of checking and rechecking to make sure that your structure is looking correct. There are things in my drawing so far that aren't fully accurate or symmetrical. I'll get to them later. One of the biggest hurdles for beginning drawing students is that there's always a tendency for us to want things to look perfect right now and to sort of erase all of the difficulty of, this doesn't look right, that doesn't look right. Let's make an edit here, let's make an edit there. There's a lot of push and pull that happens in this stage, and that's great. I really want you to engage with that difficulty. It's not going to come out looking perfect right away, and that means you're working. Once I'm satisfied with my underdrawing, I wipe out once more. At this point, It's time for me to change materials to my compressed charcoal. From here on out, I'll be using the compressed charcoal brick and charcoal pencils. This is where the assignment really begins. Now, my challenge is to see the negative space in this drawing. Everything that's not figure. I begin down by my palette, next to my vase. The compressed charcoal is very dark, so I want to be careful about only touching the negative space here. I work it into the edge of my palette. You may notice the large bricks of compressed charcoal can be hard to control. At some points, I really recommend you using the charcoal pencil to get finer detail than I do in this drawing. I work upwards around the convex edge of my vase and into the crook of my palette. Notice at this point, I'm being a little bit more specific about the edges of my vase and my palette. You can see me cracking my charcoal here. That's okay. Most artists really don't want their charcoal to be in one large piece. Personally, I prefer to draw with small pieces. And you'll notice some of the interesting marks I'm making here. I'm not always scratching back and forth. Sometimes I'm using the flat edge of the charcoal to be very specific. And other times I'm using just the corner to wedge my way into a small little area. I start leaving space for the stems of the cut flowers. Remember, there's no internal line in the final work in this drawing. All of the foreground objects, that is the palette, the flowers, the vase, the saw, we're considering those all to be one, and I'm just looking specifically at the shapes of the negative space behind. Thankfully, at this point in my drawing, I have all of the structure pinned down accurately. I can just rely on my ability to manipulate the compressed charcoal to achieve accurate edges and to leave space for all of the forms. Here you can see me pick up my stick eraser. When you find that you've overdone it with the brick charcoal, which obviously there's a little bit of, it's a little bit crude sometimes, and you can't get exactly the shapes you need, the stick eraser is a really great solution. Fine lines and details and shapes can emerge when you cut away at that very dense charcoal. You may not get it fully all the way out of the paper, but you're going to get it back very close to white. Here I've got a variety of different stick erasers, but also the large Mars plastic eraser that you have in your kit will be extremely useful. You can get a very fine, clean edge using that large eraser. You may have noticed that while my vase is clear, I'm not considering the stems and water inside the vase to be any negative space. It's like I've spray painted that vase completely opaque. There's probably a little bit too much confusion that would come from that, especially for this demo video. For all of our still life objects, we're treating them as if they're all one and as if none of them are see-through. As I move further in my drawing, I try to get more specific about the quality of the edges between my charcoal and my white paper. In some places, the leaves and stems of my flowers are very rough, and in other places they're very smooth. I can control those edges with my small stick eraser. Here I'm finally ensuring that my vase is perfectly symmetrical and that I'm not getting sidetracked by any internal problems it's having. I take several internal measurements and I use my stick eraser to make sure that there's no internal lines which might distract me. I begin work in earnest on the right half of the drawing. I block in the rough shape of that space beneath the pruning saw. You'll notice I haven't started with the detail of the teeth. I'm just sort of thinking a little bit more abstractly here and in the bigger shape. I include those bottom stems, looking always at the exact shape of that negative space underneath the saw. I work up into the top corner, and now I start to find the curvature and get more specific with the teeth. This is where it would be really handy for me to have those charcoal pencils that you guys have in your kits. Unfortunately, the charcoal I have doesn't match the density and darkness of the compressed charcoal blocks, so I'm just making do with what I have. I really do encourage you to find a higher level of specificity in the drawings that you execute this week, especially for the homework. Once I've got everything placed pretty accurately and the negative space feeling complete, I use my kneaded eraser to remove some of that excess line work from my underdrawing, really unifying that white space, helping to differentiate the figure and the ground. That way, there's no misleading information in my drawing, and it starts to feel like a complete whole. Many students in beginning drawing classes tend to gravitate towards extremely smooth charcoal finishes. You can achieve those with a chamois cloth or with a blending stump, and often students do it with their fingers. For the most part, I'm really not about that, or I should say, I don't think it's necessary for beginning drawing students to pursue surface exactly in the same way. While it is helpful into understanding exactly how the objects feel, it's more important for me to see that you're able to think both three-dimensionally and also that you're able to reduce these objects as they are into two separate classes of object, the figure and the ground. Here you can see me pulling the tape off with a little sort of finger-wagging gesture to say, doesn't this nice, clean white border look nice once it's completed? I strongly suggest you do that for the homework. It helps the drawing feel finished. And that's pretty much it. I pick up my paper, I shake off the excess eraser marks and the excess charcoal, and I call it done.